that we would, to agree with Senator Huff, just hold those items over until the May revise. That means meeting again next Thursday. Okay. All right. And so the discussion items is issue 17. UC Capital Outlay Irvine Business Unit. Are you prepared to speak on that issue? And then item 18, the CSU Capital Outlay East Bay. That'll follow. Okay, so issue 17, page 14.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Patrick Lenz, Vice President for Budget and Capital Resources, the University of California. This is a project, the Irvine Business Unit 2, that had been proposed for some time and was before you last year. I don't want to speak for, where is, oh, there the analyst is. I want to speak for the analyst, but the analyst had raised issues relative to space utilization for this project, and it was subsequently not approved by the Two-House Conference Committee. It had been approved by the Assembly, but not the Two-House Conference Committee. So we spent time working with the analyst's office to go through these particular issues, and I believe that we have had them resolved. And so I don't think, as it pertains to the merits of the project itself, there remain any concerns, but I'll let the analyst address that.
Thank you.
Judy Hyman, Legislative Analyst's Office. Our concern at this time is that this is not a high priority project. It doesn't have the life safety concerns of some of the other projects before you, and given the budget condition, we would not consider it a high priority.
And it's a brand new project, correct?
It is a new project.
Madam Chair, and if I could address that on a couple of points. First of all, it's not exactly a brand new project. As you're well aware, these projects are in development for a number of years. This is a project that came before you last year. It had some concerns that needed to be addressed, and we went back and addressed them. So if you took a look at the criteria that was used for last year and you had applied that, then this project would fall into that same criteria of other projects that were approved. Secondly, I want to comment that there are other projects on here that are recommended for approval that aren't fire life safety projects either. So it would seem to be inconsistent with the recommendation for those particular projects. But the third and most important thing, Madam Chair and members, I'd like to impress upon the committee is that these projects are developed years ahead of time before they're brought to you. They're part of a campus's 10-year plan. They come to the university for review. They come to Regents for approval. And only then are they subsequently submitted to the governor and the legislature for consideration in the budget. They are years in the making. If, in fact, the legislature is now going to establish a criteria that has been recommended by the analysts for a couple of years, I understand that we are only going to look at fire life safety and seismic projects, I think the legislature needs to be a little more definite for prospective projects and not penalize either the campuses or the projects that have been in the pipeline for some time. So we would appreciate on those 3 points that you consider supporting this particular project.
We're going to hold it open until after the May revise.
That's fair, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.
Sure, absolutely.
Mr. Lentz, you talked about a process that's led up to this point. Is there any of that will become stale if it's not acted on, let's say, this year?
I'm sorry, will become stale?
Or is there any of that process? Like sometimes if you got working drawings, other things, you might have to redo them, or is there anything like that? I'm trying to figure out how much duplicative process would have to be done if we don't do it this year.
If we don't do it this year, we've delayed another year in ability to go out and get this project moving along. Keep in mind that this project has nearly 20% private support associated with it. The Irvine campus has not had a state-supported project in 10 years. They have managed to go out and get other resources and are be able to provide the state a space for these programs. There's a high demand for these business programs associated with this school. Their demand over the last couple of years has been about 50% increase. We can't even serve the demand for all the students who are applying to this School of Business. So, this has all sorts of implications, Senator Huff, that would seriously concern us if we had to delay this project even another year. We've already delayed it 1 year.
All right, thank you.
Senator Wright?
Has the UC taken into account if you begin the program, that means that you add cost? I mean, you now have a building, but then that means you'll need more staff. And you'll have to have, I mean, years ago I used to work at the United Way. And one of the things that Frank McNamara used to point out was that sometimes if someone gave you a building, you actually lost money because you now had the obligation to maintain the building. So you're opening a program, which means that you'll need to add staff and faculty and maintenance and stuff. If we're in a budget down cycle right now, might it be better to put the, I mean, I recognize that the building cost increases to some degree, but largely that's because of the land, but I'm going to guess you already own the dirt, so the dirt isn't a problem, so the postponement increases in cost, why?
The postponement increases the cost because we're in what some might say is still a favorable bid climate for going out and bidding these projects. We don't know how long that's going to last. Certainly the financing of these facilities is pretty stable for the university at this point in time. But this is a building that's associated with growth that's been occurring for almost 10 years in this particular program. So the staff are already there. The students are already there. The faculty are there. The doctoral students are there. It's just that we don't have a physical place to put these, and we've got greater demand coming in. The second thing, this project and part of the Irvine campus plan is to move folks out of the facilities that they're in into this building, use current facilities to be able to meet their overwhelming demand because, as I said, they haven't had a state-funded project in 10 years. And then they have a lot of lease space that's off campus. They want to get out of that lease space for purposes of being able to provide some savings, bring everybody back onto the campus, and utilize their facilities to the fullest extent. So I don't think that if we sat and Senator Wright, if we really did the detail in penciling this out, I actually think that there's a cost savings in building this facility.
But I mean, that might be productive for the committee if, for example, you were to get out of leases and you were to relocate those staff and personnel back to campus, and you could offset then the lease costs. And if you say you already got the faculty and personnel and management in place, then you could project potentially a savings of some kind. If that's possible, if we're leaving it open, it might be productive for the committee to see that projection of the savings.
We can look at some detail and provide you with some information.
I don't have an aversion to doing it, but again, I think the LAO just recognizes that in a tight budget time, is this a project that would take priority over some of the other things?
No, and I think it's again, I don't disagree with the recommendation. It may be a fair recommendation, but I do think it has to be perspective. I think if you're going to change the playing field, you're going to change it for a point in time that we are now informing we're just now informing our campuses of what to anticipate, for instance, in their planning stage for the 12-13 budget. If the playing field is truly going to change, and that's the criteria that you want to adhere to, that's good to know for our planning purposes, because then those projects that might otherwise be growth projects or projects that don't adhere to that criteria, we'd have to figure out some other way to finance them.
Okay.
But if you, as I say, if you got out of, say, 10 leases, and I'm going to guess right now you're looking at $25 or $30 a foot in the Orange County, Irvine area, depending on the lease space, the reduction there, the consolidation. I mean, I think you might be able to project that there's a value to the building beyond simply expanding the program. If you took people who were in a building, moved them into that one, used the space that they vacated to cannibalize the leases. I mean, I'm thinking through what you ought to give us to further justify looking at this project outside of the earthquake preparedness and the other criteria that we've been talking about.
Okay. Department of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Member Stan Hugo, Department of Finance. While we would acknowledge that this project is not a fire life safety project, as Mr. Lenz indicated, it is an important project that needs to address current and expected enrollment needs for the Irvine Business School. For that reason, the administration continues to support this project. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll hold it open and have you come back next week and give us perhaps some of the, address some of the concerns that Senator Wright has talked about. Let's go to issue 18, CSU Capital Outlay East Bay. Thank you.
By San Juan with California State University. The Cal State East Bay project would replace Warren Hall. That's a high-rise building, about 13 stories, and that is the highest seismic priority for the CSU. It is very close to the Hayward Fault, and this would provide a space to move folks that we've taken out of the building, put in temporary structures, and move back into a replacement building that is seismically sound versus the current building, which is at the top of our list. So we appreciate support for the project and think it's a good project.
Thank you. LAO?
Judy Hyman. We agree this is a necessary life safety project, top priority.
Okay. Department of Finance?
We concur with that, Madam Chair.
Okay. Questions from members? Okay. We'll hold it open, and we're going to wait till May revise. Any surprises from Department of Finance next week, and vote on these issues next week at this time. So with that, let's go to Agenda Part B, Department of Education, LAO, supplemental reports on both school district consolidation and county court school funding. Issue 1. Yeah, just overwhelmed. Yes. Okay. Bye. Morning.
Good morning. Afternoon.
Oh, afternoon. I'm sorry. Yes.
There's no time in this room. Rachel Ehlers, LAO. I'll talk briefly today about this report that we put out last week. Your agenda does a great job of really giving the synopsis. So I think if it's all right with you, I'll use your agenda to walk through.
Sure.
And then if we need to reference the report, we can. So we were asked to look into the issue of school district and county office consolidation through supplemental report language in the Budget Act last year. We did look also at county office of education consolidation a bit. That was also part of the request. But as we started to delve into whether we ought to merge some county offices of education or offer more services at a regional level rather than county level, we really determined that that's part of a much larger educational governance discussion and what ought to be the role of the State Department of Education compared to regions, compared to counties, compared to districts. And so we really felt like that is a separate discussion, a separate report. So the report doesn't deal too much with county offices, focuses more on school districts.
Okay.
So looking at your agenda on page 2 of this Part B, it's got the figure that summarizes the size of districts in the state. And you can see that there is a wide variety. About 10% of districts in the state are what we would put into the very small category, fewer than 100 students. The minimum size threshold for a school district in the state is 6 students for an elementary district and 11 students for a unified or high school district.
Do we have any like that?
We do.
How many?
There, as I'm recalling the distribution, there are about 100 that are fewer than 100.
Okay.
And down there at the kind of fewer than 15, there are maybe a dozen or so.
A dozen or so?
Yeah.
Okay. In rural areas?
Mostly. Mostly. Okay. We don't have any minimum size threshold for school. This is just for district. So it's pretty low threshold. And we really leave, as a state, decisions about district configuration to at the local level. If districts want to consolidate, they have to initiate the process at the local level. They actually have to hold an election for voters to decide whether they want to consolidate or not. So that explains part of the variety here. So we found in looking at this that there are really kind of two camps on district consolidation. Some feel that small districts are really inefficient, they don't have economies of scale, they don't offer good education for students, that consolidation would really be a benefit. And then on the other side, some feel that small districts really do find ways to generate economies of scale and efficiencies by working together and working with their county offices of ed, and that they offer really fine educations for students and sometimes enhanced educations for students and benefits for the community. So what we did is look at these arguments and the merits of each. So in your agenda, on page 4, your staff has highlighted our major findings. And stepping back, I think what we found is that there is no ideal district size, and the academic research that we reviewed supports this as well. There's no way to pick an ideal. However, when you look at the very small school districts, what we put in this category of 100 or fewer, we did find some notable differences as compared to the mid-size and larger districts. Specifically, these very small districts dedicate a much lower percentage of their budget to instructional leaders and staff, certificated staff, compared to larger districts, and spend more on what we put in the category of overhead, which is classified staff, clerical staff, operations, maintenance, that sort of thing. And looking at student performance, similarly, there are some small differences we found between the performance of smaller districts and mid-sized districts, but they're pretty small, not compelling enough to say, hey, this is the right size. But we do have some concerns about those very small districts, again, from an accountability perspective, because they don't have enough students to generate statistically valid scores. So we can't really tell how they're doing in some ways to the degree that we can with larger districts. And this is a particular concern about subgroups of students where we track them very closely and hold districts accountable in some of the mid-size and larger districts, whereas in very small districts they don't have enough to really do that. And then I think one of our most notable findings in looking at small districts, and particularly these very small districts, is that the state is really giving quite a bit of additional funding. And you had a figure reproduced in your agenda there too. On average, more than double the amount of funding per student. So that led to our fourth major finding, which is really that one of the reasons that we're not seeing more district consolidation is because the state is providing quite a bit of funding to be small, and you would lose some of that funding if you choose to consolidate. So that's a real disincentive in some ways. We also looked at the issue of very small schools, and this is very interrelated to those fiscal incentives, because we found that the state has a necessary small school funding formula, which you all, as being on the Budget Committee, have heard about. It's a piece of the revenue limit. And I think that the legislative intent behind this was to say we may have some very geographically isolated schools that have to be small by necessity, so kids don't have to be on a bus for many, many hours, and it's hard to run those very, very small schools, so we'll give additional funding. But what we found looking at this is that many of the schools that are getting this additional funding aren't geographically isolated. You can get that extra funding just by virtue of being the only school in the district that kind of deems you necessary based on current law, and there could be another public school a few miles down the block. So that leads to the recommendations. Again, on page 5 of your agenda, staff has included them. Stepping back, our big finding is that because there is no ideal size that we could find in our review or in the literature, we would sort of recommend the state default to current practice of letting local communities decide what makes most sense for them. The exception being these very small districts where we did have concerns from both a fiscal efficiencies perspective and an accountability perspective. So while for the most part we would say don't force consolidations, we do think that the state should increase the minimum size to at least 100 because of these big fiscal and accountability concerns. And then while we didn't find compelling evidence towards forcing consolidation across the board, nor did we find evidence for why the state should continue to discourage districts from opting for consolidation. Some of the ways we discourage this is by providing so much extra funding to remain small. Why would a district opt to walk away from that? So we have some recommendations about eliminating some of those fiscal incentives to be small, and some statutory changes to help eliminate some of the disincentives for districts to opt for that consolidation. And then finally, looking at the issues of very small schools, tightening the eligibility requirements for that necessary small school funding formula, and taking a look at whether the state might want to consider a minimum size for schools.
Okay. Any comments? Is the Department of Ed here? No.
Quick question.
Okay. Senator Huff?
On page 5, I think it is, in our staff report, you talked about the CEQA review and eliminating some protections. Could you quantify that a little bit more? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Right. These are two statutory provisions that we identified that may serve as disincentives for districts to opt to consolidate. Right now, current law suggests that they would need to do, districts wanting to consolidate would have to complete a CEQA review, even though it's, in some cases, no movement of bodies or dirt or anything. It's just consolidating. So we'd recommend clarifying that isn't necessary unless there were some of those more tangible environmental impacts. And then current law also says that if 2 districts or more districts choose to consolidate, they can't lay off or reduce the salaries of any classified employees for 2 years, even if those responsibilities are no longer necessary because they have achieved economies of scale. So we would recommend making that statutory change so that districts that do opt to consolidate can realize some of the potential savings immediately.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. I think that's it, right? It's no action, just information, and appreciate the work. I know we have somebody in the audience for public comment on the small schools.
Madam Chair, Senator Huff, thank you for the opportunity to make public comment. While we have some concerns with the legislative analyst report, we do believe that they've pointed out some very good issues. We believe that there may be concerns about how do you encourage people to look at consolidation more than they would otherwise do within current law? How do we ensure that there are cost efficiencies while maintaining the educational outcomes? The research is unclear on district size. The research is not that unclear on school size to address and overcome the effects of poverty. In many small districts, but not in some very small districts, are in areas where there are high numbers of students from poverty. We are concerned on the lapsation proposal, and because this is just being accepted, those types of concerns we'll discuss if there is legislation and policy committee, because there are parts of California where there is not another place where you can go easily. When you think of Trinity, Siskiyou, some of those other counties. But we do want to work with the legislature on looking at efficiencies. We agree with the LAO that this should be by votes. Right now, there are situations where county boards of supervisors, city councils, LAFCO, and like that can make a request and initiate a program. It is local. We should believe it should be a local vote. And finally, the most important issue from our point of view is every student in the state of California should have the same access to quality education regardless of where they live. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's the measure we should use for reviewing these recommendations. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any, we'd welcome the superintendent's office and CDE.
Hi, Erin Gable on behalf of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tom Torlickson. We really appreciated the LEO's review of this issue, and we believe that they're correctly pointing out the school districts vary widely throughout the state. There is no basis for imposing a one-size-fits-all mandate that small school districts should consolidate. There are advantages and disadvantages of school district consolidation in any given situation. Some of the issues raised in the report are very much appropriately discussed in the context of school finance reform. In particular, the school district and school size criteria in existing law should be reviewed in connection with new developments in online learning technology and in distance learning, just to name a few things. We also have a couple other specific comments. The report discusses the apparent contradiction between state policies that encourage the consolidation of small school districts and state policies that encourage the development of charter schools, which can also be very small as well. The report does not highlight as much as we would actually like to note the point that this contradiction should be noted and that small charter schools will ultimately present some of the same types of concerns that small districts can also present. We also wanted to note that there is a current loophole in current law that's not in the report, that school districts can claim small school funding when some of their enrollment is transferred to charter schools. This provides an incentive for school districts to organize charter schools for fiscal reasons rather than for educational policy reasons. This is another issue that we believe should be also investigated in the context of school finance reform. We also would recommend that the legislature and the LEO consider a revisiting of the definition and the parameters of our necessary small schools in the context of school finance reform to make sure that the intent of the legislature and the intent of that incentive is being met. We would point out that in some settings, small school funding is not necessarily an advantage, as might have been characterized in the LAO report, that we believe that it's actually a necessity. Schools located in small and isolated communities can simply not operate without some of the subsidies that they receive due to the necessity of small class sizes and also, of course, the rural nature of many of these locations. And we believe that the data will bear this out. That very small districts can spend significantly more on staff and on transportation costs than other school districts, and that needs to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions from members? Okay, well, thank you very much for the report. And the last item today is the analysis of court school cost pressures. Welcome.
Jennifer Kuhn from the Ledge Analyst Office. And as the white paper is being passed around, I'll just provide a minute of context or background for why this issue is before you. So last year, as you might recall, a few county offices of education testified before you that they were having some problems with their court school budgets. And under current state law, county offices do receive a higher revenue limit rate than district programs. So counties roughly receive $9,000 per pupil for students in alternative schools, as opposed to a district receiving about $5,000 per pupil for a student in a comprehensive program. So the higher revenue limit rate as it stands is an acknowledgement that there are higher costs, smaller classes, other things that are associated with these alternative schools. What came to light last year was that county offices weren't able to access economic impact aid. And so given the concerns that had been expressed with the court school budgets, the legislature made a determination last year to make them eligible for EIA. So they have a higher revenue limit rate, and they now have access to EIA funding. At the same time last year that the legislature took this action, it also directed our office to look at other categorical programs to see if county offices, on behalf of court schools, had access to an appropriate array of programs, and then to compare court school rates to other alternative school rates. So the white report before you does this analysis. So going over what we found, on the categorical, access to categorical funding, we found that they do, by and large, have access. So if you were to turn to page 4 of the white paper, figure 3 lists all of the remaining applicable standalone categorical programs and shows whether county offices on behalf of court schools are eligible. 9 of the 12 they are. And of the 3 where they're ineligible, none is a particularly good fit. For example, court schools aren't eligible for K-3 class size reduction, very rarely serve children that young. When you look at the programs, the 40-some programs in the flex item, before flexibility, county offices could apply to most of them. So there also wasn't a systematic bias against county offices. At this point, though, given those allocations are both flexed and locked in place, it's largely irrelevant. Now, someday, if you wanted to rethink flexibility, the issue would reemerge. But for now, again, it's not a particularly relevant issue. So although we weren't explicitly tasked with going beyond, since access to categorical funding does not seem to be a primary cause of court school budget problems, we decided to ask a few questions and do a little bit more investigation to see, is there any obvious explanation for what's driving what might be shortfalls in these programs? So we did find two cost pressures that are relatively unique to court schools, and one has to do with class size, one with special ed. So on class size, county probation departments, if they're concerned about safety of children, can require county offices to have relatively small classes in court schools. One court school reports that one of its classes is 9 students, where most are on average about 15 students. So probation departments, although they can require these smaller classes, they don't bear any of the associated costs of those higher classes. Also on special ed, these court schools are reporting that their special ed rates are on average about twice as high as the statewide average. And some of them are able to negotiate higher pass-throughs with their SELPAs, but some aren't. And so about 40% are, about 60% aren't. And lastly, when we compared court school funding rates to alternative school funding rates, other programs, we found generally programs are getting more funding when their students have greater needs, with the one exception of community day schools that are the only alternative school program to get supplemental funding for a longer school day. So comparable alternative schools that serve similar students, county community schools and court schools, although they serve, again, similar or even more at-risk students, they don't get the supplemental funding to extend the school day. So we had 3 relatively obvious recommendations. On the class size, the state could consider that if probation departments do decide that there needs to be a particularly small class for safety reasons, that in those cases they share some of the additional cost, incremental cost of having a smaller class. With special ed, the state could do a variety of things, ranging just from reinforcing legislative intent that SELPAs negotiate in good faith. 40% are doing that already. All the way to considering within the existing special ed appropriation, maybe doing some reallocations so that court schools would get a supplemental rate. If the state wanted to do some additional study, figure out what the additional costs were and what would be the appropriate supplement. And then finally, for the community day, if the state wanted to even spread this funding out more evenly, it could take the supplemental funding for community day schools, spread it out across all comparable alternative ed schools, and this would equate to about $1,000 per pupil more for a court school. So there would be a variety of ways, if you wanted to address these cost pressures, that you could without an additional cost on the state. Again, lastly, just to reinforce, many of these things are local, and different court schools are being affected differently because of these local dynamics. Nonetheless, the state could consider doing some of these kinds of things, whether it be legislative intent or some supplemental funding within existing allocations to try to minimize or mitigate them.
Thank you. Department of Ed?
Thank you. We wanted to thank the LAO for this deeper look at the court schools, these necessary schools, and we just had a few comments about the report and the issue in general. And as you know, the County Offices of Education review and approve school district level budgets as part of the fiscal accountability scheme put into place by AB 1200 a number of years ago. And of course, FCMAT has very recently been reporting to you on the progress in that task. But what you may not know is it's actually the responsibility of the California Department of Education to approve and review County Office of Education budgets, and as part of the same scheme under AB 1200. So we have firsthand knowledge of the budget-related concerns that are facing our County Offices of Education. And we can confirm that the 2 major issues reported by the LAO are the same 2 that the department would have identified in regards to our reviews. One, that small class size resulting from limits imposed by probation departments do create concerns and cost concerns due to and have been put into place because of safety issues, and that special education costs can be greater than the funding available for these court schools. We can also confirm that the use of flexible funds is not a source of relief for county offices of education as it is for other school districts because of the reasons that were cited in the LEO report. And finally, we agree completely with that the legislature should reevaluate the various types of alternative programs and put into place a more rational funding scheme that recognizes the differences between student needs and holds schools accountable for meeting those needs rather than funding based on types of placement. This issue should be addressed as part of the legislature's overarching school finance reform conversations. Then we have a few more comments. One is that one core issue that we believe is not mentioned in the report that is notable is that county offices of education do not have the same flexibility that other school districts have to fill shortfalls with funds that are generated from general education pupils because they do not provide general education. All of their services are specialty services in nature. For example, special education services are not fully funded by the state special education formula anywhere in the state. However,
Right.
other school districts are able to make do by pulling from their general education, general purpose funds. Also, the report suggests that the state may want to consider placing strings on special education funding, perhaps requiring greater allocations to county offices at the local level. The Department of Education at this time would not recommend that the state interfere with the local decision-making of the SELPAs in this regard. We believe that at this point that the basis would be unclear for this conclusion that county offices of education lack leverage at the local level to negotiate what they need with their SELPAs for their special education funding allocations. Instead, we would suggest that the solution to this issue should conform to the basic principles of AB 602, that we fund based on the population and then allow flexibility at the local level. Then the report appears to conclude that court schools are underfunded, and we just wanted to note for the committee that court schools do currently receive a higher revenue limit than other school districts, and it might be worth evaluating the extent to which this current larger revenue limit funding provided by the state for court schools ameliorates in any way some of the issues that have been cited. And we also wanted to just highlight a couple other things that we would believe would be needless complications for the report itself, but just wanted to highlight it for the committee. A reminder about the deficit factor, of course, that is imposed on our county offices of education, which is about $2,000 per ADA, or 18%. And the amount of categorical funds available to county office court schools is very small in comparison to this deficit factor number. And we also wanted to note that much of Community Day's school supplemental funding is subject to categorical flexibility, and so that just complicates the conversation of what's happening with these alternative schools.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any questions from members? Senator Wright?
The concern I have, I guess, is it's probably clear that if you're a court school, you're going to have a disproportionate number of special ed kids juxtapose a normal formula. So the 9 versus the 5, I get that. I'm not sure that even measures it, because there's another dynamic. In a court school, I'm probably more familiar with Los Angeles than I am other areas, but there are groups of kids that you can't put together in a classroom. So I might have a group of kids from one part of town, and I necessarily have to put them in a classroom separate from the other kids because the teacher and all the kids will be dead. So other than that small detail, it would be okay. But that becomes an additional cost consideration as you're calculating. And the tendency for violence there, I think, also causes, many of the kids who are in the county court school system are probably as violent as they get because they haven't transitioned yet to where they will ultimately end up. So you've got a concern about special ed that is special, so to speak, because you have a significant safety consideration. Given that, we may need to look, I realize that we ain't got a whole lot of money to spend, but in that context, we may need to look at how we allocate that. Additionally, I know last year we were looking at how much we were spending at the state court schools versus the county court schools. Now, if the number in the state continues to dwindle, this will become an insignificant issue, but that number that I understood, and the LACO people may correct me, but the number that we were spending on a state court school child was substantially higher than the number that we were spending on a county court school child. And we might need to look at that formula as well.
I apologize, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I do know that this is an issue that's been raised time and time again, particularly in the budget context, the concern of our county court schools, of the inequitable amount of money that they receive to work with students of similar, or if you have noted, sometimes more equally difficult situations or challenging to educate, and they do receive a lower rate than they do at the state level.
Okay. Senator Huff?
Thank you. For LAO, one of the court schools' complaint is they lose funding every time a student goes to court. So even though they don't have a control over that, what do you think would be the possibility of just scoring them absent as opposed to not attending, if that makes sense? Excused absences for funding purposes.
Yeah, court schools have certain unique challenges because a child might be pulled out for the trial for security reasons. But average daily attendance is still, I think, a good faith effort to try to record how much instruction is occurring in these places. So I don't know whether they were, I guess if there was a change in statute to declare these somehow approved absences that could count toward attendance, it might make a difference. It might also be a relatively small part of their overarching problem. To the extent that they, again, have a problem, I think it depends on your perspective and what the appropriate solution is. But I think it's worth contemplating.
Yeah, and maybe they're using a sliding scale, if not full ADA something, because some of them are going to be coming back, and it's not their choice, it's not the schools, it's a fact they got to deal with. Some would say that there's generous youthful offender block grant funds that counties get. Is there a way that the court school costs could be paid from these?
I think the notion of a cost-sharing agreement in certain instances was where we concluded might be an option. So the youthful offender block grant, although many people consider it primarily revolving around security issues, the language allows it to be used for education. And at some point, the issues are blurring a little bit when probation departments are making choices for educational and safety reasons to have small classes. So it was in this instance where we thought the probation department does have access to these resources and could share a portion of the costs when they're actually driving the costs when it comes to saying a class can't be 15, it has to be 9 for the kinds of reasons that have been cited. So we do think there's adequate resources there for the probation department to bear, again, incrementally, the costs of reducing these classes from, say, 15 to 9.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We have people waiting in the wings to make public comment. I want to thank you, Jennifer, for doing a little research on this. And I do have some public comments on it, too. Go ahead. Please join us.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members. Michael Hulsizer here today on behalf of the 58 California County Superintendents. Michael Ricketts was unable to be here today. We also want to thank and commend the LAO for finishing this report. It's an important report, and while we think in some instances there's some larger issues that are missed, it really does put an awful lot of good data before you and gives us an opportunity, I think, to speak to some of the issues that we're most concerned about. First of all, the report identifies two very real cost barriers or cost drivers that are unique to court schools. The first is the requirement for smaller class sizes. And as the report points out, this is driven in large part by law and also by probation and law enforcement officials who have responsibility for these students, but it's also driven by the needs of these students. Let's be honest, as Senator Wright pointed out, these students are very challenging. They have tremendous multidisciplinary needs far beyond just education, and it's our responsibility to address those needs. So the cost drivers are very real, and it starts with small class sizes, but it also involves many other needs that these students have in terms of mental health, health and human service needs, as well as the safety of students and the people, the staff who work with them. The second is that there are significantly lower allocations for special ed funding for these students. There's only one county in California that actually has a SELPA made up of the court school. In the other 57 counties, the court schools are a part of SELPAs that are serving regular ed students. And the fact is, as Senator Wright points out, there are disproportionate numbers of special ed students in court schools, and the current funding formula doesn't recognize that at all. So it's a significant cost pressure. So those are mentioned in the report. But there are also some very significant cost drivers that aren't mentioned, significant cost pressures. The first is that the students placed in juvenile court schools are incredibly mobile. The reality is, many of our court schools have students that are literally there for 3 or 4 days, up to a maximum of a year. And most of the students are there for less than 2 months. Those are significant cost pressures because we have diagnostic needs. There are needs that you have to do initially to identify appropriate placement and needs of students that are just constantly turning over. For example, we have about 13,000 ADA that we receive each year in our court schools, but we serve almost 60,000 students. There's no other school in California system that has that kind of turnover. And so those cost pressures are great, and the report doesn't speak to that. The other thing that the report doesn't speak to is the increasing number of high-need students that court schools in counties are now serving. We used to have over 8,000 students in our California Youth Authority served by the Department of Juvenile Justice. We're now under 1,000, about 700 students. Our population in this state hasn't shrunk. Those students have been transferred to county court schools, and their needs are still there. Now, the Department of Juvenile Justice receives about $30,000 per ADA for those students when they serve them, for good reason. Some of that's through court decree, but it's driven by common sense. The legislature's provided that funding because those students have great needs. Well, those students now, in significant numbers, are being served by county court schools, and yet we're comparing court school funding to school district funding. We think we should be comparing court school funding to the Department of Juvenile Justice funding to serve these students. We also think that it's important to recognize that at the same time that funding hasn't been cut at DJJ, as the Department of Ed spokesperson pointed out, we've been cut 18%, about $2,000 per student. We've received the same revenue limit cuts that school districts have received. And yet the challenges of these students are as great, and the reality is we don't have the flexibility to move money around. What Ms. Kuhn didn't point out, but that's in the report, is that when the LAO surveyed counties about their use of categorical flexibility, which has been a tremendous tool for school districts to manage budget cuts, that hasn't been an option for county court schools. They found no evidence that counties were engaging in the use of categorical flexibility, even with the categoricals they had, because the needs of these students were so great. So we would simply conclude by saying the resources that are needed to serve these students appropriately are simply not there. We understand the challenges that you're under, but we do think there's an opportunity for you to look at the cost savings that the state has received from the shift of these students from DJJ that's now going to county court schools.
Pamela Gibbs, representing the Los Angeles County Office of Education. Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing today. We know it's Thursday afternoon. We appreciate the opportunity to address these issues before you. I just wanted to add just a few points. I know it's late in the afternoon. One thing I wanted to address is the categorical funding and the issue that county court schools have access to numerous categorical opportunities. Just recently, this body extended EIA eligibility to us. That was historic because we hadn't received that before, yet our children are designed to be eligible for that program, disadvantaged, low-income ELL students. And as you know, most of the kids we serve are often black and brown kids. They are tailor-made for that categorical, and just last year they became eligible. We thank you for including them in this opportunity, but there are plenty other opportunities where these kids have been excluded. Several years ago, our office fought for inclusion in middle and high school supplemental counseling programs funding. We didn't get that, and that was for supplemental counselors for students who are at risk, and I can't think of any better child. That's just another example. ERA funding. We were, and this was just an error, but we were excluded from the first round of SFSF funding, the stabilization funding. County offices of education weren't even included, and the list had to be rerun so that we could be included there. The problem with that kind of exclusion is that the districts are then receiving a lesser amount than they thought they would receive. These are the issues that we face every single year. There are other categorical fundings, both state and federal, that our grants office has to put upon ourselves to show that we're eligible for. It's not something that we just get, even though it looks as though all of these funds are available to us. So we wanted to mention that. Lastly, I just want to say that we cannot be compared to other alternative ed programs, and Mr. Holsizer mentioned that. We cannot be compared to districts. We cannot even be compared to alt ed programs. When I was reading through the report, it was almost like the Sesame Street segment, one of these things is not like the others. There's only two programs that have incarcerated youth. That's DJJ and the juvenile court schools. Those are the two programs that we need to be comparing. They both receive Prop 98 funding. If there's excess funding in one program, because of the rapid and remarkable drop in population at one, then the funds should shift and follow the youth to the county program. Last year, you took actions to assist the county court schools. We ask that you take another action this year to transfer excess funds. We noted $20 million last year. I don't know what it is this year. We can use your assistance with this. But all of those dollars are needed. This was a realignment. If there's only 1,000 kids there now, if there's 700 kids there today receiving education, the realignment has already occurred. It just hasn't been funded. So we'd like your assistance with that. We thank you for all of the questions you've asked, and we look forward to working with you on this and other issues.
Hi.
Good afternoon. John Scribner, wearing a different hat. I'm a member of the Sacramento County Board of Education, and we've had a lot of study sessions and a lot of involvement with these issues on a weekly basis now with our board. In following up with what Senator Wright was asking earlier about the situation with the classrooms, part of what we also have to take into consideration, quite frankly, is because of the students we're dealing with, we're having to be careful about which group, which affiliation is in that classroom as well, to avoid a turf disagreement, to avoid a confrontation. So we also have to deal with those types of situations in that classroom. And I wanted to share with you something else that's going on, and I'll refer to as an adverse selection. Because of the financial situations, we're finding more and more of the districts are trying to keep some of their students. So what we're seeing in our court and community schools are students who've really earned that ticket to that classroom. More violent, less responsive, more of the challenges you were talking about in terms of IEPs and other situations surrounding those youth. So that's driving our costs up as well, because we're having to watch that class size, and we're having to have others nearby, because safety is a very real consideration. And we're also seeing that in the hall, because because local government is so strapped as well that they're really being picky about who they ultimately put in there, that they used to put there. So the type of student we have there now also tends to be more violent than they used to be as well. And then to follow up with Senator Huff's comments earlier about For example, the wards that then have to go to a court hearing, for example, we also deal with the fact that the corrections facility, probation, winds up often holding some of these students in their cells as well as a punishment or a discipline. So they're there, but they're not going to class. Our instructors are there, our aides are there, but we don't see that ADA. So I just wanted to share with you a couple of these observations, and I appreciate your taking the time to discuss this.
Thank you. Senator Wright?
I don't know how to do what I'm trying to describe. There are people who are a whole lot smarter than I am. But it would seem to go back to Senator Huff's point that we might need a kind of alternative ADA structure where, because, I mean, by definition, if a child is in the court school, he's going to court. So you create an imbalance because the reason he's there is he's going to court. Most of the children who are in the court school are not sentenced there. There are some, but that's probably a small percentage of the total number of children who are there. It's impossible to create a scenario where you hire a teacher for 2 days. Or, as Mr. Scribner pointed out, you may hire the teacher for 2 days, but those are the 2 days that the kid's on lockdown. So the teacher's there, and you have an obligation to pay the teacher, but there was no student for him to teach, and the ADA didn't follow. I think and I don't know how to do this, but there need to be perhaps some level of a minimum based on the number of kids, and then the minimum be kind of dealt with so that you don't have the vast swings depending upon what happens with the child, recognizing that he will go. I think as well we'd better be careful that the lawsuit that followed DJJ, given that essentially we're talking about the same kid. I mean, every kid who ends up at DJJ came through your program, and now some of them are coming back. So that I think that some smart lawyer may conclude that that same lawsuit should apply because you're talking about effectively the same kid. So it might behoove us to look at ways to get in front of the next lawsuit. And again, I apologize, I'm thinking out loud, which is a terrible thing for people in my line of work to do. But I mean, again, it might be that we say that the floor for, say, LACO is X number of dollars. And then you know that on a budget year that you'll function with that much. And if there's an expansion in, say, a month or over a period of time, that you adjust it that way so that it's not as peak and valley as you would currently operate. Now, I don't know how to do that. I don't know if it's legal. I just made it up. But I just throw it out there for someone to play with.
Thank you, Senator. LACO did try to sponsor legislation to do a hybrid of what you just suggested. It was an ADA enhanced type revenue that sat above the ADA limit. So it was based really on enrollment. That was something that we tried to do. Again, we're educators. We know how important it is to have attendance. So we even shy away from enrollment-based funding because we're educators. That's what we do. And we want to be able to educate our kids. So we thank you for that, and I think it's a good discussion that we adjust that now. There's a roadmap already telling DJJ exactly how to fund this type of program, and it came down in the Federal Consent Decree. It's already a roadmap that we can look to. It says exactly how many kids should be in what kind of class, and this occurred before the rapid decline in pupils. So it was a fairly, I guess, reasonable funding limit that court addressed. And so I do have copies of the Federal Consent Decree. I'm sure I've sent it to everyone before, but we can look back at that. It's not that we have to create a new thing. This is something that's already been done. I don't think the legislature, LAO, any of us have the time or wherewithal to go through and try to create something when it's already put in place. It may be adjusted somewhat, but it shows class sizes, it shows how many resource people you need. It's very detailed, and I think we could use that as a roadmap to address these concerns.
Would it be legal, and here I'm guilty of thinking out loud, the bus that takes the kids to court typically leaves at about 7:30 in the morning. Again, I'm more familiar with LA than I'm anyplace else. But it typically leaves at about 7:30. It gets them to the various courts between 8 and 8:30. Court typically starts at about 9, give or take. And that child would probably be returning about 2 to 3, which means that in a typical school day, they would have missed school. Would it be possible in a court school to start school later? Could you say start school at 2 o'clock and have a greater chance of capturing the educational day because you tried to work around the court schedule? You understand what I'm saying? So if you know that the child's going to go to court, then could you adjust the educational time period to kind of reflect that reality and then start it later, recognizing that there's got to be a meal period? But given that he's a resident anyway, it ain't like he's going nowhere. So I'm sorry, I should, but you know what I'm saying? But you have him in custody or in residence. So it might be that we adjust the instructional time to coincide with the court time to try to achieve more education.
Senator, I am aware that there are some courts that hear juveniles cases later in the afternoon. I'm not familiar with the converse happening, and that certainly is a good question. But in LA, the numbers are so large.
Right.
I'm sure that probation is carrying a large bus of kids over there, and I've even heard instances where they stay downtown overnight and then come back. Now, I don't have any facts for that, but those are things that I've heard in the past. I don't know if that's what goes on today, but I have heard that courts do hear in other counties. They have heard juveniles cases later in the afternoon so that the kids could attend school.
I just don't think there's any statutory prohibition from doing that. And if you were managing your program as a court school and you had large numbers of kids that were gone during particular parts of the day, I think you have freedom to say we're going to have a teacher who stays and works from 2 to 3 because we have 15 kids who weren't here from 8 to 9. I don't think the statute isn't written so in such a prescribed fashion that a program must be during actual at certain hours of the day.
I mean, maybe it's dumb of me, but would it be goofy to maybe have the people at the court school have a dialogue with the people who run the court and to try to coordinate the schedules of the kid? I mean, so if you took the presiding judge of the juvenile court and said, can we try to arrange a window of time in which the court takes place and we can try to manage the education around that schedule? I mean, I don't know enough about either institution, but it would seem to me that that dialogue might provide a better educational opportunity for the child.
Senator, I think that's occurring.
Right.
And to be honest with you, I'm not aware that the issue of actual students being in court is the major reason why our students aren't always in class every day. I don't want to dismiss that. That could very well be a reason, and it may be a primary reason in LA. But I think there are many other reasons why the probation officials decide that a student shouldn't be in class on a given day. I also want to go back to the point about funding for other than ADA. I want to say here, our county court school administrators are very sensitive to accountability, and they, as Pam said, I don't think they want a situation where they're getting paid for students that they're not serving. There need to be incentives in place to get students in class every day, both on our end but also on probation. So I don't know that we would support, I don't think our court school administrators would support a blanket system of just court schools being paid for students who are enrolled or in beds. But they do, I think they would, as you're suggesting, want to look at some consideration for perhaps excused absences or ways to fund students in a more reasonable way that they have no control when they can't serve them. But I do want to make the point on their behalf that they're not asking to be paid simply for enrollment.
But I think I'm sorry.
It's okay.
The concern is just as you pointed out, if the teacher's there and you only had Johnny for 4 days, and Johnny leaves at the end of the 4 days, your cost doesn't drop. I mean, we've kind of done an ADA formula, but in that general framework, it assumes that you have that child for a set period of time, and we just created that increment as a way to finance it. But your allotment of time with the child is a much smaller block of time, and chances are you may replace that child. I mean, like, I've got some schools in my district where the turnover rate is 140%. So that, but other children keep coming, so there's always X number of kids enrolled, but over the course of a school year, that seat will be transferred 3 times, even though, so there's always a warm body there, but it ain't the same warm body. Yours is pretty much the same thing, where there's a constant turnover, and you've got kids going to court, and you've got kids on lockdown, but that doesn't alter your cost of providing the service. So I'm not trying to say that we should pay you for kids you're not teaching, but I think that we would try to recognize that there's a different dynamic in what you do versus what a school does when that child goes home. But I'm thinking as well, it doesn't, and maybe it's happening and I don't know, but it doesn't seem like we're taking advantage of the fact that the child is also resident there. So it's not like at Gompers, it's not like he's going home. That is his home for the time being. And so we might want to think of managing more of that time since we got him anyway.
Well said.
Ms. Gibbs, maybe you could invite Mr. Senator Wright to one of the court schools in LA County, and he can look firsthand at how we deal with this.
I've been there.
Yeah, great.
Real close to being.
Right, and I've been out to Challenger, and that was the facility that was under the court order, and you do have a challenging system, and this finance part of that mix of how difficult it is. But and I've asked Senator Wright, because he's very interested in this population, as to whether or not we could work together on some of the issues that were brought up today regarding court schools. Just as a, and I don't mean to not involve you, Senator Huff, you're welcome to participate too. The continuation schools in high school districts, is that just regular ADA?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So it's only the community day schools, the community schools, juvenile courts, the county schools get the, quote, the extra stipend of $9,000, theoretically $9,000 per student.
With few exceptions, it's the county-run programs that get the higher rate, whether they're a court or a community day school.
Do the kids who enter the community day schools or the communities, and the community schools are paid a little bit more than the community day or the juvenile court schools?
In total, yes, because they qualify for the supplemental funding. So on an hourly basis, it's about the same. It's just that the state is funding a court school for 4 hours of instruction as opposed to 6 at community day.
Okay. Is it impossible to increase the number of hours for the community schools or the court schools?
Well, we did survey this because we were trying to get, again, at cost drivers, and about half of the court schools are already at 5 hours. So they are finding ways to run a longer program, even though the state's funding formula is based upon a minimum school day of 4 hours. But I think we still don't think there's much rationale for giving more funding to a community day school than to a court school, for example. So you could take the supplemental funding and just distribute it more evenly across the programs. This would allow court schools to choose to do an extra hour or enriched instruction or to help with some of the other issues that you've been talking about today.
Okay. All right.
Just the last thing that I thought it might be helpful, because I think there's quite a bit of conversation between the comparison of DJJ and court schools, and we probably do injustice to both of them, and we probably should just focus on court schools. How much does it cost to run them? And that's partly why we decided to look at these cost pressures and to say how much does it cost to run a court school program. But I think some of the data has been suggesting that somehow the DJJ kids are just it's been shrinking and the court schools are growing. But if you look at ADA numbers, at least, and I recognize the difference between headcount, but court school ADA from 2004-05 to today has gone down from about 16,000 to 13,000. At the same time, DJJ has gone down from about 3,500 to 1,400. The populations in both cases are declining more at DJJ, no doubt, but declining in county court schools as well. And so the second point that I think is sometimes made is that somehow the DJJ rate is the right rate. But I think one of the reasons DJJ has been so vulnerable for realignments is because there's concern with the rates that the state is offering at DJJ. And it's on the realignment table again under the most recent governor's proposal. So I think, again, if anything, is just to take into account what are court schools, what types of students are they serving, how many of them are there today, and what are their basic cost pressures, as opposed to doing the comparison.
Thank you. I mean, I am interested in this topic, and I was out at the DJJ facility in Ventura County with Senator Hancock maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we were looking at the girls' population, and because there's only, I think, about 40 girls left in the program, and and these young people are there because they have committed serious crimes, and I think the folks out there said that maybe 10 of them needed to be put into a wing of a women's prison as opposed to being back integrated into our county system. And, it's really, from my point of view, it's really tough to see a young person, I mean, these are kids in the system that are 25 years and younger, put into a state prison system for the crimes they committed. And even though if we separate them from the general population and create their own wings and things like that, it's a very difficult, from my point of view, a very difficult situation. And it is, I don't know whether or not we can relook and rethink about how we deal with this particular segment of the population, both in terms of financing and how we do services, wraparound services, and how we try to rehabilitate this population. Because out at Challenger, we ask the question of these young men, how long have you been here? How many times have you been here? And most of those hands went up. These kids have been here 3, 4, 5 times. I mean, these kids are candidates for our state prison system. I mean, there's nothing going on there that's going to rehabilitate them to be productive citizens, and that's my concern about, how we are delivering services and how important it is, how the education part of it is really important. And the other day, Senator Hancock had a sub-5 meeting on the education system in our prison system, and a teacher indicated that hopefully this is an exception, not the rule, but there is an adult male student who's been in first grade for 10 years. How does that happen in our system? And we are all paying for this. I mean, it's just unbelievable how we're just not working it to get our folks back to normality. I mean, I don't know what normal is, but, just being productive citizens, et cetera. So, and it's all at our expense, and we're not doing anybody any good. So, I mean, that's just a little sidelight, but there is connections here. We are trying to put together these connectors as legislators, and it's all linked together, what we do. And so, in trying to find efficiencies out of the system, and I know people are doing their best, but I'm not so sure about what we're doing is the best way of solving this problem. Ms. Gibbs, you had a comment.
Yes, just to address a minor point regarding the declines in both DJJ and JCS systems. Although JCS programs have declined, the complexion of our programs have changed dramatically. The child that we used to serve 10 years ago was what some of our colleagues called bubblegum chewers, and you just want to slap their wrists. And the complexion has now changed to a DJJ youth. So if you're looking at a bar graph of how many DJJ youth we used to serve, it has grown, and the bubblegum chewers keep shrinking.
Correct.
So this is why we have more challenges. We're trying to address the concerns that have been raised. I know LACO has been making major improvements. We have worked with FICMAT, we've worked with others, we've worked with advocates, and we're really struggling. We're really working hard to make improvements to these programs. But the children that we're receiving now are more violent. They are more challenging youth, and we think that additional resources can help us not improve the prison going rate, but to improve the college going rate. I've been to Operation Graduation. I don't know if any of you have come
Correct.
to that. And of course, it's a tearjerker. I mean, it's had major, lots of tissue in the room, but there are many kids who do well in this system. We want to increase that opportunity for those who are with us, and we appreciate the comments that you've made. We're very sensitive to that, and we want to continue to improve, as do my colleagues around the state.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Well, thank you very much. It's been an interesting conversation. Hopefully, it's just the start of something in trying to improve the system. Do we have anything else? Okay. All right. I appreciate all of your participating today, and we'll be back next week to take some votes after the May revise, and hopefully that we can get some of these projects off our list. Thank you.